The medieval period of Western philosophy is rarely given the kind of attention it deserves. This is because the majority of thinkers during this period were also religious figures. In the West, a big part of the reason for the religion-philosophy connection was because the church was just about the only place to find people who were both literate and who had the kind of time necessary to dedicate to the study of philosophy. Between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the start of the Renaissance in the 14th century, the Western civilization had almost entirely collapsed. It was a combination of Greek, Roman, and Muslim ideas that brought it back to its feet. In this module, we'll focus on two major medieval Western thinkers, Saint Anselm and Saint Aquinas. They both came from the Catholic tradition and had a massive impact on philosophy. But first, we have to address the elephant in the room, religion. These days, we commonly see claims about the incompatibility of science and reason, as in the case of the aforementioned conflict thesis, and there is a general sense that religion requires that followers stop thinking and suspend their reason. Therefore, we will start with a little-known but rather influential thinker, Ibn Masarra, who died in 931 AD in Muslim Spain. We start with him in order to note the role of reason in at least some religious traditions, which at least dispels the supposedly universal problem of reason and religion. We will make this aside because otherwise there is little chance that we can understand the meaning and impact of the two authors assigned to this module, or their philosophical importance. In one of his two surviving texts, Ibn Masarra lays out the relation of reason and revelation, which is something like a connection between human experience and metaphysics, humanity, and God. He begins with an interesting analysis of religion. Getting your faith right is an important issue because being wrong can have disastrous consequences. But there is a problem. We don't have direct knowledge of either God or revelation. It's always secondhand information, and so we don't know what beliefs to adopt. This is the case for all people, aside from prophetic figures. Prophetic figures, if they are real, would have a direct experience of the divine, and so they would know the truth. However, just because someone claims to know a divine truth does not mean we can trust them. People are sometimes mistaken, sometimes they are malicious, and sometimes they are insane. Because we can't share the experience of prophetic revelation reception, their prophecy and certain knowledge about God don't do anything for the rest of us. However, as human beings, we have access to reason. Crucially, we all use the same reason. It is not an artifact of this culture or that one. Reason is a universal human tool. Since we can't have access to the experience of God or revelation, and our eternal reward or punishment ride on that decision, Ibn Masarra says that we must use reason to determine the correct set of beliefs that we should hold, and therefore reason must be enough to make this task possible. Now obviously this relies on the idea of reason as human telos. If the purpose of humans is to use reason, then the use of reason to decide on beliefs is consistent and coherent. So, since we can't have the experience of revelation, we use reason to look at the claims of a religion, and then we check for the internal coherence of the claims, and then the external coherence. If the religious ideas are unreasonable, as in they contradict themselves, then reason tells us that the system will not work. Note here that, aside from the rare cases of prophetic figures, reason trumps faith for humanity, and it does that from a religious perspective. Now, this relationship of knowledge and the divine can work in two ways. One is from the top down, from God to man. And that is quite literally the way that revelation is supposed to work. It is lowered from the heavens, from the divine, onto humans. The other way knowledge might work is from the bottom up, from man to God. So we start with knowledge of the world, and then we reason our way up through additional abstractions until we reach some concept of what is the highest moral value. One way to see this is as two separate processes. Revelation deals with one kind of issues, and reason deals with another. But this is the kind of thinking that gives us a separation of reason and faith. Ibn Masarra's claim is that these two processes use the same space. Therefore, rather than being unrelated or about different issues, reason and revelation are set up in a way that complement each other. It's like being given rules from on high, but if you think about them, they also work coherently and match up with the world. Reason and revelation get you the same set of ideas, at least generally speaking. This is why Ibn Masada says that Abraham was the first philosopher. If you recall the story of young Abraham in the article Role and Value of Religion, that's a story from an Islamic perspective. At least that's the start of it. But the key is that in that story, Abraham was not a prophet yet. He had had no contact with the divine, neither God nor angels, and he has had no revelation. He's functioning purely off of reason. Obviously, this is not a universally accepted idea, but we're looking at it specifically because the reading for today is looking at medieval philosophers who were also theologians. If we want to understand how this process worked in their heads, then we need to understand how they saw the world. As evidenced by Ibn Masada and a whole host of other religious thinkers who made major contributions to philosophy and other fields, the idea that religious belief is about blind faith is not the way that the religious thinkers, or history really understood religions to function. And here we'll go on a bit of a tangent because it is really important that the way you read any text is coherently informed, otherwise you will miss the point. It is often claimed these days that religion is supposed to be irrational and that people believe because of miracles, as if that has been the universal historical setup. And here we have to look at the idea of the texts to check whether this makes any sense. And we'll just take a peek at the Old Testament because that's the one you're most likely familiar with. Miracles are not reasons to believe blindly. They are not the kind of thing that should make your brain stop working. They are proofs of authenticity of the speaker. That makes them rational proof of argument, at least for those who are around to witness them. Imagine if I show up and tell you that I'm speaking on behalf of the creator of the universe. Well, you have no reason to believe me. At least that's what Ibn Masada says. So what I need to do is authenticate my claim. So if I tell you that from a blue sky, lightning will strike 10 times in a row on my command and hit whatever target I designate, and then as I count upward from 1, lightning really does fall out of a blue sky and strike the targets that I designate, I have established some sort of authenticity of my claim. This works even better if you ask for a specific miracle and I get to deliver. This way of understanding the point of these stories also draws your attention to the fact that sometimes rational argument alone is not enough. Sometimes you have to provide proof by demonstration. We saw this with this story of Abraham. Even then, however, someone who does not want to change their mind, for whatever reason and on whatever issue, religion is not exclusive in this realm, there is nothing that can be done to force them to do so, because this is their exercise of their free will. This is also the reason why there is no case of a successful miracle changing the attitudes of a whole people in the Old Testament. Individuals may change, but the group itself generally does not. Even the Israelites in the story of Moses, after witnessing the plagues in Egypt, after walking through a parted sea, and after having food fall literally from the sky, still failed to fix their attitudes and behaviors as a group. And that's where we see the problem of them worshiping a golden calf. The point that's being made by these religious texts is that reason is the only thing you can appeal to, but at the same time there is no way to force anyone into believing anything. It is always up to them what they choose to believe and how they choose to act. Even strict laws do not prevent people from breaking them. They may condemn them to severe punishment, but the person is still able to try to do what they want. This is why just outlawing murder does not solve the problem of murder. With that background in religion and the use of reason, let's get to the first author for today, Saint Anselm. By the way, I always add the honorific titles like saint, because these are the recognized accomplishments of people. It does not matter if you believe in the value of those titles, they still reflect a lifetime of effort the person invested, and so it seems like a matter of common courtesy. So the point of St. Anselm's work was to attempt to prove the existence of God by clear and certain argument. You may notice that this is similar to Al-Ghazali's definition of certain truth, with the absolute certainty of ideas like 10 is more than 3. If such proof was found, it would end the whole debate about the existence of God, and would probably severely limit the number of possible religions, because that kind of definition of God also has a lot of implications about the nature of God. Now, St. Anselm thinks he has found such an argument by defining God as that than which no greater can be conceived. If your brain seems to go on the fritz when you hear that statement, you're not alone. But it is a very carefully worded definition. Notice that it would be easier to say something like, a thing so great that nothing greater could be conceived. The problem is that you just define God as a thing, and all things are limited by definition. Same problem kicks in if you try to use any kind of a similar term. That's why St. Anselm does not use the kind of language that could box you into a bad interpretation. What he is doing is trying to set up a definition in a way that negating it would break the laws of logic. Since we can't actually break the laws of logic, we can't even imagine what that would mean, and so his definition would have to be true. So let's take a look at the two laws that he's interested in. First, there is the law of identity. That says that each thing is identical with itself. By this, it is meant that each thing is composed of its own unique set of characteristics, qualities, or features. Everything must be identical with itself. Nothing can be not itself. If a thing could be not itself, then it could be anything else. Why? Because everything else is not that one thing. This is a pool noodle, but if it can also be not pool noodle, then it could be anything else. It could be a spaceship, it could be JFK, it could be Hitler. The law of identity is great because it tells us when we're making a nonsensical statement. Since we can't actually break the law, it catches when our ideas are out of sync with one another and forces us to fix our terms so that they match. If you say something like, well, for me, 3 is greater than 10, it means that the definitions you are using and the definitions I am using don't match. Maybe you're using the idea of greater to mean better. And if we're talking about getting sentenced to prison, then getting 3 years is better than getting 10 years. But you see how that's a redefinition of the terms. You still believe that 10 is a larger number than 3. That's why getting 3 years is better than getting 10. The second is the law of non-contradiction. And that one states that nothing can both exist and not exist in the same way, in the same place, and at the same time. You can't even imagine a violation of this law. Attempt to imagine seeing this pool noodle and not seeing it. Now do that simultaneously. Not as in it's flashing in and out of existence, but both existing and not existing simultaneously. Since the laws of logic cannot be broken, not even in your own head, St. Anselm is trying to define God in a way that the negation of God would require the breaking of these laws. This is the kind of certainty that Al-Ghazali talks about with that 10 is greater than 3 line. But just as importantly, although it may seem like you can disagree with the statement, you can only make noises. You can't actually imagine or comprehend that disagreement. Try as I might, I can't imagine how 3 is greater than 10, because the ideas of 10 and 3 contradict the 3 is greater than 10 line, in a way that it's not possible to actually have that as a meaningful idea. For St. Anselm's definition, you have the same problem. If you try to argue against the existence of God, then you are contradicting the law of identity, and you are contradicting the law of non-contradiction. In other words, you can't actually have St. Anselm's definition of God and believe that there is no God. These two are mutually exclusive ideas. Now, Guanillo replies to St. Anselm, saying that existence is not a necessary part of imagining a greatest thing. And as proof, he asks if imagining the greatest island ever would mean that the island would now have to exist. But he failed to understand the very careful phrasing that St. Anselm uses. As a result, He's asking about a physical object, while St. Anselm carefully excludes all physical attributes in his definition. Why? All physical objects are conditional, meaning they can not exist, they can exist, and they can exist and then cease to exist. That means that their existence is not necessary for the universe. But the existence of God, on the other hand, is not about physical existence, but about a concept, an idea, and in particular, a necessary idea, like the existence of integers, necessary to the very existence of all other things. Now, I can imagine a non-existing island. I can even remember an island that used to exist but now does not. But I can't imagine a non-existing integer. Any integer I imagine must be a thing that exists, because I imagined it. See the difference? St. Anselm's argument, also known as the ontological argument, is a classic these days. The wording is so interesting that it has not yet been resolved. But I want you to notice something here. In El-Ghazali's work, in St. Anselm's work, and even in Guanilo's reply, there is no hint of God being some bearded man in the sky. There are none of the ideas that commonly get criticized about religion these days. In fact, what you are seeing is a highly complex set of rational and philosophical arguments about the nature of reality, human conception, and logic. And keep in mind that this is coming from people who are not just religious, they have been canonized as saints. This is the top theologians and church figures. Obviously, the idea that religion somehow prevents the use of reason is rather silly when viewed historically. The works of St. Aquinas are on par with those of El-Ghazali in number and complexity and interdisciplinary nature of their work, and they also prove that Islam and Christianity can certainly get along fine and can interact on the highest intellectual levels. To be sure, St. Aquinas would have thought that Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd are infidels, but the same would be true for Aristotle, and that certainly was no obstacle to learning from them. For our purposes, we will only consider a few key ideas presented in the chapter. The first is the distinction between essence and form. The essence of a thing is what it is, what it can't help but be. The essence of a thing is true under all conditions because it is the core part of a definition of what you're talking about. Let's look at an example. A house is a structure that serves habitation. That's it. That's the essence of a house. You can have a house in a naturally occurring cave, on a space station. You can have a birdhouse, a dog house. Your house may be an apartment, a condo, a town home. The key part of what makes a house is that it has the potential for habitation. If you turn your house into an office, then it ceases to be a house, because the potential is no longer habitation, but workspace. The form of a thing is all about the incidental qualities. Incidental qualities, also called accidents, are the features that happen to be this way or that, and have no real bearing on the essence of a thing. This pepper is red. The red is an incidental quality. How do you know? Well, what color is the pepper in the dark? What color is it to someone who is colorblind? See how the color seems to be changing? That's how you can recognize an incidental quality. But features like extension or mass, not weight, are not dependent on anything else. The mass of the pepper is the same in sunlight, in pitch darkness, on the moon, and on Mars. In other words, these are features that are essential to the peppers, while things like color, smell, and other incidentals are, well, incidental. St. Aquinas develops this distinction because it plays part of teleology. It will also affect the way we think of things like first causes, which is the next part. If you look at the proofs of God offered by St. Aquinas, you'll notice that almost all of them are based on the idea of first cause and the impossibility of infinite regress, also known as reductio ad infinitum. In other words, he sets up the argument so that you're left with two options. Either existence as we know it is impossible, or you need God. Again, he's not talking about the old bearded man in the sky idea of God. He's using a rational philosophical definition. Let's get down to the problem of infinite regress. This issue was first recognized by Aristotle in the West, and that seems to be where St. Aquinas gets it from. But he puts it to use in new and innovative ways. Here's how this works. Everything that happens in the universe has a cause. That is, there is an explanation and a causal relationship between the thing that happened and what happened before. If something happens, if there is any change in the world, something caused that change to happen. So we have a cause and then an effect. But if that cause was static, if it did not somehow change, then it could not have caused a new effect. Why? Well, because otherwise it would permanently be producing an infinite number of that same effect. So as soon as we see change, something had to cause it. So now our cause is also an effect of a previous cause. And then the same thing happens with that cause and so forth. You can think of it this way. You did not always exist. That means that something had to create you. That's your parents. But they did not always exist either, so something had to create them. That's your grandparents, who were created by your great-grandparents, and so on. But there's a problem here. If this chain keeps going, then it can never actually get started, because you can never get back to that starting point. Unless a process gets started, you can't get any effects. But that's precisely what happens if your chain of causation keeps on going to infinity. For every event, there was a preceding event. And so there's an infinite number of events, which means that the whole series could never have gotten started. Let's use that example again. The chain of your family can't extend backwards in history forever. If there wasn't a first set of your ancestors, the rest of them would never come to exist. So you need to have a first ancestor who gets the ball rolling. A different analogy here might be falling dominoes. Every falling domino causes the next one to fall. But unless something drops the first domino, none of the others would ever move. The problem is that a domino can't cause itself to fall, so you need something that is not a domino to make that first domino fall. But, you might be saying, didn't you just tell us that every effect has a cause, and that every cause is also an effect? Yes, that's what I said, but here is where Aristotle and later St. Aquinas find a way out of the problem. You need to have some kind of a first cause that's not the same as the rest of them. If you have a thing that can exist without being caused, then it can be the first cause of all the other things without making the chain of causation infinitely long. When you imagine that set of dominoes falling, you know that a person or a cat knocked over the first one, so that first cause was not a domino. So how do we get one of these first causes? Well, you can only have one of them, and both Aristotle and St. Aquinas thought of it as God, even though they had very different definitions of what God would be. Let's go back to our family example. At some point, your ancestors must not have existed. And then, something that was not your human ancestor created them, and they got the ball rolling. This may seem a bit odd. Did a human being just spring into existence fully formed? Well, for our purposes, you can consider that biology tells us exactly this. You had a first human ancestor who did not have human ancestors themselves. He had an ape ancestor. And technically that ape ancestor also had an amoeba ancestor, if we go back far enough, who had a simple single-cell organism ancestor, and that single-cell organism ancestor just formed itself out of non-living parts by sheer accident and for no reason whatsoever. Anytime you have a first cause, it has to be drastically different than all the other causes in the chain. So how could this God character not need to be caused by something, the same way that everything else apparently needs to be caused? Here we have two explanations. First, and this is what Aquinas is thinking, the fact that something exists now means that the series of events did actually get started at some point, and that means that there was a first cause that caused everything else to exist, and that means that something radically different than our reality must have caused our reality to begin, and that thing is God by definition. That first cause line is logically necessary because infinite regress is a logical impossibility, and it would be the only other option on the table other than a first cause. Second, and this one's a bit trickier, you can think of the problem this way. Everything we can say about the nature of reality and the universe is only true for our universe. In our universe, all effects have causes. But because something created our universe, whatever the source of that creation is not playing by the same rules as our universe. In fact, it's not even part of our universe. Whatever would have been the first cause could not have been in our universe because our universe didn't exist yet. Our universe itself is an effect that must have been caused. That cause can't come from our universe because the universe didn't exist. So whatever is causing it has to be outside the universe, and so it's not limited by the rules of our universe. Because it doesn't play by the same rules, there is no reason to think that it needs to be caused. Now for Aquinas, if God was an entity in our universe, then he would have to be explained by the same causal relations as everything else. But God, by definition, is not an entity in our universe. He's outside the universe. That means that there is no reason to even believe that such an explanation is necessary. And again, because we're actually here, it means that some such cause without a cause exists. That thing is, for Aristotle and St. Aquinas, God. The last argument St. Aquinas proposes is the goodness of nature. It says that goal-directed behavior is found everywhere in nature. But you can't have goals unless you have awareness. So rocks have no goals. This means that nature is directed by something, and that something has a goal in mind. And that is, by definition, God. Now this is a solid argument, but it has a fatal flaw. At this point, we'll make a detour back to teleology, because it is the basis for this argument. Recall that telos is the direction, goal, and direction of progress for a class of being. The idea that nature has a telos, remember the cat and humans, was the core idea of all societies until about the 1850s. Even when European Enlightenment had essentially rejected the role of the church and religion, the idea that there was a purpose to existence was retained. Before that rejection, telos was supported by religious ideas, but it stuck around even when the religious ideas were rejected. But with the publication of Darwin's Origin of Species, all that changed. The problem that surrounded Darwin's concept of evolution was not the idea that man came from apes. That part could be explained religiously. In fact, a full 1,000 years before Darwin, Al-Jahiz, an Islamic thinker, proposed the entire theoretical side of evolution along with the material causes, changes to species, and adaptation that became whole new species. No one batted an eye, and it was widely accepted throughout the Islamic world. But what he did was give God the control over how the process actually played out in terms of the changes ultimately adding up to God's plan. So this is the telos that God imposes on creation. What Al-Jahiz did not say is that we can see or calculate this process of God's decisions, just that it was present. This makes sense from his perspective because teleology was a general assumption on all levels of every science. But when Darwin proposed the same theory 1,000 years later, he changed that mechanism a bit. He changed it because about 200 years earlier, Descartes had the brilliant idea that all things that are real must be made up of material substances. And this means that if there is a part of a process that you are describing, it is either physical and observable, or it does not exist. Darwin could not find anything like God's plan working as a mechanical part of evolution, and so he could not include it in the process. Now, of course he could not find it, because it's a metaphysical notion, and it was taken as a basic assumption. This means that without a telos, evolution became purely a matter of blind chance, or random changes that were not headed anywhere, had no meaning, and had no goal they were aimed at. And this is the part that got people flipping out. Well, why is that? Without telos, there is no purpose to life, literally. Greeks and Christians and Muslims and essentially everyone else on the planet had the idea that humans have a purpose. usually reason and society. The fulfillment of this person was the thing that we should be doing. If we did things contrary to that purpose, we were wrong, including morally wrong about our actions. This way, we could also derive universal morality from nature, and these things help guide human behavior. This idea was behind the concept of natural law that became inalienable rights in the US Constitution. But once that telos was gone, there was nothing that we should be, and no limits on what we should or should not do. Acting like an animal, rape, murder, and theft was no longer wrong. What I mean by this is that it no longer ran against some kind of a universal natural morality, because that no longer existed. All that mattered was survival and reproduction. By that measure, Genghis Khan was the most successful human, since he had about 16 million kids because he raped and murdered his way across 2 continents. Note that reproduction is about having kids and having them survive. The way you get those kids, love and marriage, or mass rape, are irrelevant to the evolutionary success. Reason and society took a massive hit because they no longer mattered. It turns out that this move by Darwin would be a catalyst for things like Nazis, not to mention any number of other atrocities, because a sense of universal morality was gone and all that mattered was survival and reproduction. We'll deal with this fallout more when we get to modern philosophy, but it's worth pointing out that this conclusion was not Darwin's goal. He merely explained a system which had no room for teleology, because teleology is a metaphysical idea, and science denies the existence of metaphysics because it can't measure it. Now we mention this because St. Aquinas' argument from goodness of nature was all about the telos, and so we reject it because it no longer matches the kinds of assumptions that we make about science and the world. But it's not a bad argument. This is important for us to understand because otherwise we will fail to understand not just St. Aquinas, but all pre-Darwinian thinkers. St. Aquinas had a good argument, but the acceptable parameters for science and the role of science in understanding the world had changed. That's why it seems wrong to us, not because the argument itself is broken.